Hello, welcome back to Poddingham Podspur, the Spurs podcast about Spurs podcasts. I'm your host, Ian, chatting to you from a very lovely period of football. It's the World Cup happening right now. It's quite fun if you can tune out and ignore all the other nonsense that's happening around the tournament, which isn't to diminish it, but it's not great for everybody. But from a footballing perspective, it's been pretty good. I have had a nice time of it. I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to get into it, if I'm honest, because of all the noise and just because of like a sense of apathy coming out of Spurs' season. You know, I think I was a little bit done with football, a little bit exhausted, but it's been such a good tournament so far. Like some really exciting games, teams punching above their weight. Uh, Crowds have been incredible. Some of the stadiums are just look wonderful. I was just watching the Panama versus Croatia game, and just to see Panama just going for it, there's a real sense of like knockout football about the second games, and I can only imagine that's going to be intensified in the final games of the group stages. Just with more teams having stuff to play for, with this whole third place team going through to the knockouts, the round of 32. So yeah, just give some credit to FIFA. Where they've enacted some pretty good changes from a footballing perspective for this tournament. Not so hot on everything else, but 48 teams has given us a bunch of teams to look at who are pretty good, pretty fun. Playing some nice-ish football in places, and yeah, it's just been a good tournament. It's been a good break from Premier League football. So, speaking of breaks, I've as you know, I've taken a week or two off from recording Poddenham. I think my last one was an interview with Jack Hussey of Rule the Roost, which went very well, and I had really nice response to it. So thank you to everybody who listened, shared, and commented on Spotify. And if you've found Poddenham through that podcast, welcome. I hope today is going to be a nice little introduction to what I'm all about outside of interviews, because I'm going to do a little bit more of a deep dive subject today. Not really responding to what's happening in the Spurs universe, although there's plenty. And if you want to hear me talking about that, you can hear me on the Wicked Spursy podcast, where I react to kind of real time events with Mike, Jonah, and Brian. But yeah, today we're going to be doing a little bit of a more analytical pod on blogs. Remember those? And I say that because I remember them and have started my own blog. So for those of you who follow me on Blue Sky, you know I've recently started a Substack called Bloggenham Blogspur. That's another mouthful podcast, or another mouthful of a name for one of my creative ventures. And I figured, because I've just started my own blog, which I'll get into what Bloggenham's all about in a second, I thought this might be a nice time in Poddingham to cover the history of Spurs blogs, some contemporary blogs that are coming out and are being made right now, and just some other stuff that I felt like talking about. Before we dive into it, just a little bit of housekeeping and advertising. If you found me already, welcome. You can also follow the show on Blue Sky at poddenhampodspur.bsky.social. You can also email me, poddenhampodspur@gmail.com. Jesus, I nearly forgot my own email there. Drop me a comment on Spotify. Reviews are always welcome. Share with your friends if you like what you hear. And yeah, that's kind of the spiel. I'm still, after a year of doing this, not very good at switching off the self-conscious part of my brain when I have to do the advertising bit. So Bloggenham Blogspur, I started it recently. Not really inspired by anything in particular, any blogs that I read, but more so a sense that I needed something to supplement this podcast, this show, because there are certain things that I can't really talk about in some of my sort of Poddenham episodes because I'm talking about a theme or a particular subject. And just some weeks, people are doing some cool stuff or are talking about things that don't really fit the narrative that I'm trying to piece together. Very often they're interviews or they are like, little asides, little fun little things they've done. I can't really talk about Tom's teasers on the Crowing Cockerel in a regular Podnam pod where I'm talking about, reactions to a North London derby or a new signing or something similar. So I really wanted a space where I could just go through and track across the week my sort of impressions or takeaways from various podcasts I've listened to. And I'll drop like into some example blogs for you to like read in the show notes. But broadly speaking, I've put out a couple so far, and they've focused on, like I said, a kind of whistle stop tour of what I've been doing, what I've been listening to, and kind of the highlights from those podcasts, as well as a few other fun things thrown in, like sharing recommendations of non-Spurs related media that I've been enjoying that week. And I'm trying to put it out weekly, but we'll see how that goes. I also needed a space for more data analyses and lists of podcasts or podcasters or whatever, things that would be very boring for me to just read a list of on this show, even more boring than the content I put out. And there are things that I would like to put out there that may not be as widely visible if I only put it on Blue Sky. So another place to put that stuff. And yeah, this kind of format might be perfect, like I say, for the more special one-off types of shows that people put out, especially over the summer. So subscribe to Bloggenham Blogspur, and maybe you'll get something to listen to on the beach. So yeah, blogs and podcasts are kind of complementary but different approaches to expressing your fandom, right? They both have their advantages and their negatives. Generally speaking, they are kind of cool in their own ways, and there's different reasons for starting a podcast or starting a blog or putting yourself out there on Instagram or Twitter. But I'm not talking about social media yet today. Maybe another time. But they blogs and pods I think are kind of fun because they're both independent platforms for the most part, free of club oversight. Sometimes journalists have to toe a certain line when they talk about the club. There are things that they can't say. There are things they can't speculate on for fear of damaging relationships, stuff like that. Now, some of these podcasts and some of these, maybe not the blogs so much, but they are part of larger networks and organizations. Think of something like SB Nation and Cardinals Free Captain on the blog side of things, or I'm forgetting the name of it, but there's a podcast collective, which Rule the Roost, or Sports Social. There it is, the Sports Social podcasting group, where some of the bigger Spurs podcasts are part of, and there are things that come with that which are benefits, but there are also some restrictions that I imagine are placed upon content creators. What I like about a blog, though, is that for the most part, it tends to be a singular voice of a person writing, rather than a compromise between several people expressing their opinions, right? So, like, if you have a podcast with one or more hosts, it's a conversation. You're reacting to the thing that has just been said. You're exploring ideas together. But sometimes there are things that you can't get out because the conversation moves on, or you don't want to get into an argument necessarily. That might surprise some of you if you've listened to certain Spurs pods that some people don't want to argue, but that's definitely the case. It also just gives you some time to mull over an idea. They can be flexible too. Algorithms in general will favor certain lengths of podcasts and push them into your timeline. Whereas in terms of a blog, you can make it as short as long as you want. You can include images, graphs, I think something else that I really like about it is that it gives you, the reader, some time to kind of ponder what you're reading. You have to be taken on a journey by a podcast as you listen. You can, of course, rewind, but it's not quite the same as taking a second to reread a sentence quickly, or to come back to it later and look for links or whatever else was suggested. It can be less convenient. Don't get me wrong. A lot of podcasts, I hear people go for a run, or they're working or doing housework or driving. You can't really drive and read a blog about podcasts in your car. At least I hope you're not. Generally less engaging as well, I would say, because you've got music and editing and tone of voice and various other exciting things that you can get into a podcast, unless it's this podcast and you're listening to my voice. And something that I found is that it's just a different type of effort that goes into a blog and a podcast. And I think it really depends on the skill set of the person recording or writing them. But generally speaking, I do feel that podcasts have a lower barrier to entry. Anybody can get their phone out and write something now. And obviously you see that on X, on Reddit, on Instagram, or wherever. But there's something about crafting and weaving together a longer narrative that I think is a real skill versus kind of rambling into a microphone for 30 minutes, 60 minutes, or whatever. They're both interesting. And I think it all just depends on, what the content is that you're engaging with, the person who's writing it, what they're doing with the format. I'm always a big fan of, whether it be podcasts or blogs, that people just make the most of the space that they're expressing themselves in. I've talked before about, podcasts that come out with an idea, and I think that's great. They're going to come out and it's not just me and my mates are all the funniest people you've ever met type of stuff. It's people who have an idea, a concept, a structure, something that they're going to do that's going to twist the format. And I like that in some of the and I like that in some of the blogs that are around now. Like I said, use of graphics, things which maybe could be considered to be a little bit drier if it were a podcast. And maybe that's why I'm attracted to a blog for the type of work that I do on this show. So if we look into the history of, Tottenham Hotspur blogs, info is generally patchy. So this is kind of it's going to be a little bit piecemeal for this section, from what I can still get from, various forums and websites that are still around. There's a lot of links that have gone dead because their website owners, the writers, are no longer sustaining them. They're no longer paying for hosting, things like that. Or they took them down because, they've gone on and got jobs and they don't want to have that kind of content out there for whatever reason. But realistically, for the history of Spurs blogs, I think you do have to go a step back and go take yourself out of the internet space and go into the meat space, the real world, and look at fanzines. I'm not specifically qualified to talk about them. I wasn't really at all, in fact, I should say, engaged with Spurs fanzines in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s. But they were there, and they were people who were passionate about Tottenham, who were fans, who were supporters, and were putting themselves out there and making something. And so I think you can look at blogs as very much an evolution of that process, and an amplification and a kind of a viral spread of this idea that you can have something to say, and you can share it with people to read. If you want to learn more about like the kind of fanzine culture, you could look into something like A People's History of Tottenham Hotspur by Martin Cloak and Alan Fisher. It's a great book. I highly recommend it. I think they talk about it a little bit in there. Some of the fanzines that I'm aware of, starting in the late 80s through the early 90s and maybe even into the mid 2000s, were Spur, My Eyes Have Seen the Glory, which I think is now available as a website, and Cock-a-doodle-doo. So anybody who was a big fan of fanzines. Reach out and let me know if I've got this right or wrong. And I think fanzines are really cool. I spent a lot of time in my teens and 20s in kind of the DIY punk scene around London. And there were just so many people trying to put content out there. I think that's why I like podcasts, is because it's kind of the that DIY perspective. I can make something. I can write something, print it, and share it. I can pick up a guitar and play. I can shout into a microphone. I can podcast into a microphone. And I think it's very cool. And I would love to hear and see more stuff about that culture of sort of match day fanzines around Spurs Stadium. And I like the idea that some people have tried to keep it going. The Fighting Cock had a few that they put out. Obviously, there were some excellent writers in and around the Fighting Cock. You got the 1882 fanzine, which I think is still ongoing, which is both in print and online. I think you could only buy it online at the moment, but we'll see what happens in that space. So, people trying to, put out some high quality work is very cool. But in terms of actual, blogs that people share on the internet, I did find some early-ish, like mid-2000s blogs. And I'm going to ignore kind of things like early forums, early, posting sites, stuff like that, because I'm going to try to focus on things where it was somebody where it wasn't kind of a conversation between multiple people. It was more of a situation where somebody has a space to write long form text about Tottenham Hotspur and share it specifically under their name. So, something like Spurs Online, N17, which are now both defunct, have shut down. Come to mind. There's a few others that have shut down as well, like When the Spurs. There's a Substack of the same name, but I don't think it's related to the Blogspot that they used to be. White Hart Pain and Tottenham TTKM, which I'm not sure what the TTKM stands for. I just found it on the r/COYS sidebar on Reddit. But two other ones which are very notable, I think, are the Dear Mr. Levy blog run by Spooky, which started in, I think, May 2007, and Windy COYS, so Chris Miller's blog, which started in 2009. And both of these, I feel, really brought my attention to the concept of writing about Spurs as a blogger, as opposed to like a journalist or I don't know, something that you write down in the back of your history textbook. And both do great jobs. I think they set a kind of approach and a standard for what people like about Spurs blogging and were capable of doing. Dear Mr. Levy obviously comes out of the idea of directing it towards Daniel Levy, former chairman of Tottenham Hotspur. But Spooky's posts have often been long and philosophical and quite sort of verbose screeds that he would share online. And I think that you can see that style emulated in some of the modern day blogs. Every time I talk, I say blog, I want to say podcast. So if I'm slipping up, I apologize. And Windy's, in a very different approach, was much not want to say organized or drier, but much more focused on analysis. And again, we're seeing that now with some of the blogs that are out there, and I'll maybe talk about, maybe won't. But of course, this period of time, 2007, 2009, I'm talking about, is just before the explosion of microblogging as something that people were doing frequently, and social media coming along as kind of lower effort, higher visibility approaches. So Twitter, right? Like most Twitter threads nowadays could be a blog anyway. They're so long, but there's much more attention and much more of a dopamine hit for somebody who wants to put their thoughts out there in an organized manner on X or Blue Sky or Threads or what have you. r/COYS, I mentioned the subreddit earlier. It's a place for people to drop as well as the shit memes and match day conversations. But there are a number of kind of hyper focused analyses that people put on there, which essentially could be a blog. But the advantage there, of course, is that you've got thousands of people who are going to read it versus your Substack, which could be seen by a couple dozen if you're lucky, right? There are some Facebook pages too, which are still going. I'll point out Harlow Globetrotter has a kind of a popular Facebook page, which very often veers into longer form text and is more like a blog than it is really kind of a Facebook page in many ways. There's also a couple of other sort of sites that are kind of like blogs, kind of not, like something like Top Spurs. I think this is Spurs India website as well, which has a lot of like really cool history things. But as far as I can tell, they don't seem to be too. They haven't been updated recently. But again, they're kind of more fan sites, I guess, than they are blogs. And kind of define blog as something that somebody updates semi-regularly to weekly or daily, where it's a singular voice sharing their opinions in a text format, which has to be longer than 250 characters. And so some contemporary blogs that are out there, and I can't comment on their popularity, and this isn't going to be like a comprehensive list, but there's quite a few out there actually in the Bloggenham Blogspur blog. Fuck me, that I'm going to link in the show notes. I think I found about 26 or 27 active blogs. There could be a few more depending on when. If they get, some of these semi-regular blogs are updated soon. But if you look at the last couple months, it's about 26 to 27, including aggregators as well as those which are more transformative or newsletter in basis. There are some which are news-oriented but have sort of transformed the concept. So if we exclude, for now, somebody like Ali Gold, right, or The Athletic, right, that's clearly a journalism focus. Alistair Gold, I actually included in my Bloggenham blog because when he writes things which are more opinion based, he does come at it from the perspective as a Spurs fan. But in terms of blogs which are sharing news, you've got things like Cartilage Free Captain, which covers both the men's and the women's team, Hotspur HQ, To the Lane and Back, Spurs News. These things are taking current events, including rumors, and adding commentary to them rather than just kind of staying as just a news source. We've also got aggregators. So these are places which are just kind of collecting any old news story that comes along, and that's a hard job in and of itself. And I'm talking with a slightly condescending tone because I don't particularly enjoy aggregators too much myself. Very often they're quite clickbaity, but that's the name of the game. You got things like the Spurs Web, Spurs News, Spurs Hub, which is new. It's more content aggregation in general, including a list of podcasts, and something like THFC 1882.com. There are those which are more opinion or soapbox, you could call them. People who have they need to express an opinion, they need to put something out there, but they're not necessarily doing something more analytical or news based. And you've got things like Tottenham on My Mind by Alan Fisher, which I think started in 2009. Martin Cloak, he tends to write more about general football matters, but is obviously quite important in terms of Spurs culture. Dear Mr. Levy, I already mentioned. The White Hart Review I find really interesting. So this is Andrew Pettifer's idea. He wrote a really cool book 2 years ago, about the Europa League final season. But the idea is to have articles written by different folks on various topics that they want to write about. I've actually asked to write something about a recent supporters club event, which I need to get off my ass and actually do. But you've got people like Gareth Dace have written on there. It's meant to be, I would say, almost more like broadsheet opinion piece in nature, but with actual an editor in the loop, which I enjoy. And then some smaller podcasts. There it is. Some smaller blogs, I want to say. blogs with less attention, but have a presence on Blue Sky that I do want to shout out, like Distilling the Essence of Musa and We Only Drink Holston. And also Steve Curtis's The Spurs Pig. It just, that's, I hope he posts again. I enjoyed that he started something back in February, but didn't. He needs to follow up. There's more analytical blogs, things like Windy's blog I've already mentioned. He's pivoted from being more focused on the Spurs youth teams to now kind of fleshing out and following up some of his ideas and discussions on the extra inch. You got Podspur. Aaron basically will do a deep dive onto whatever tickles his brain. I don't always agree with Aaron, and this is obvious if anybody follows both of us on Blue Sky. But I value that he's putting himself out there and is sharing his work. There's not many people out there who will say I have an opinion and here's why I think it with with citations almost. You've also got somebody like Upstate Spurs. And what I like about Rob is that he does both a little bit of match analysis. So you get weekly content, but he will also do those deeper dives just like Podspur does, as I just mentioned. I also want to call out two blogs which focus specifically on Spurs women. You've got Tottenham Across the Pond, written by Caroline Stefko. It's a great blog. It's really, really good. I read it every time it comes into my newsletter. I'm a full subscriber. She's moved recently from covering both teams, so both the men's and the women's teams, to solely focusing on the women, and that's terrific. I always found her writing on the women's team to be more engaging for me because I learn a lot from people who are knowledgeable and passionate about the women's team, whereas the men's team I'm going in with kind of my own opinions, and I don't know if I'm paying as much attention generally when I'm reading. I've also just absorbed so much information from podcasts that I find it refreshing. And another amazing resource for the women's team is the Spurs women's blog, and they're great too. There'll be links to all of these blogs and websites in the Bloggenham Substack. You can go in there and you can read anywhere where somebody also has a podcast. I've also annotated that, and I've just given kind of a brief description of the 20 to 30 Spurs blogs and websites out there who were on my radar. I do also want to call out there are some examples of Patreon blogs. And, I can't necessarily see all of them, but I am aware, for example, The Extra Inch has both Windy and Bardi, excellent writers. Nathan's analysis lends itself very well to a blog. I'm not sure if he's shared much in that format, but Windy and Bardi definitely do. There's Bardi's book club, stuff like that. Very interesting stuff. Bardi also writes for the BBC as a regular contributor, as a fan's voice person. And those are great. So this is something you can pay for. It's like a logical next step for a podcast where they have a Patreon. It doesn't require audio editing and all the other kind of high level polish that these more popular podcasts demand. You can write it down and it's I think it works. I think it works pretty well, and it's good additional bonus content for somebody who's subscribed. Now, I mentioned, just then that blogs and podcasts are complementary for the most part. As far as I can tell, podcasts are not necessarily adverts for blogs or vice versa, at least in the fan space. You could definitely make an argument for journalists that Talking Tottenham with Alistair Gold or View from the Lane or The Tottenham Way, they're all advertising their work in the Times or the Athletic or Football.London or wherever, right? But as far as I can tell, people are just kind of making content because they want to, as opposed to they need to drive ad revenue. At least in blogs, obviously podcasts have people who it's their livelihoods. But I'm not. Anyway, I'm getting myself all mixed up. Sorry. In many ways, you can see the progression, though, from how blogs, the text format, ended up launching a number of pods, and I've just got a little list here. I know at the top of this podcast I said I wouldn't read too many lists, but I'm going to for a second. You can go through and see Cartilage Free Captain in 2011-ish, launching Wheeler Dealer Radio. Dear Mr. Levy went on to, feature strongly Spooky on The Fighting Cock and also his own podcast, Filthy Shambles. Windy's blog in 2009 ended up doing youth updates on The Fighting Cock and then into the Extra Inch. When I interviewed Jack on my last episode, he talked about how he wrote some sort of blog content before moving into Trunk Animations and The Fighting Cock and The Rule the Roost. You've got Harry Hotspur and the Boy Hotspur. Profspur now has launched his blog into being a regular featured section or topic on the Oso Spurs podcast. You've got Spurs News, which is both a website and a podcast. So that's really interesting. People get this kind of bug and interest, and they say, okay, I want to deliver something that I can't do in my current format. You can see this also in places like forums and social media, where you've got X launching, I think, Spurs related and their podcast, Facebook with CADS, Blue Sky with Yaps, Poddingham Podspur, and more. I think that's a very sort of interesting progression from text to audio. I'm curious about why people think that might be the case. I'm not sure if there's too much that works the other way. I mean, also, sorry, I should go back for a second. N17 Women, I think, also came out of the Spurs Women blog. So there's another example. So there's quite a number of blogs that ended up launching pods. But on the flip side, I think it kind of depends on your definition of a blog. Some shows have launched websites and are using those. I mentioned Spurs Hub earlier, which is new, more content aggregation, but that seems to have come out of some Tottenham YouTubers in an attempt to pull things together. There are, Oso Spurs, Jim has launched a newsletter. I think An Echo of Glory has one too. The Game is About Glory on their website occasionally will have a blog, or will include some of the content that Milo or Steph or whoever discusses on the show. It's more about using the website for many of these podcasts, it's more about using their website to organize podcasts and supplement them with the occasional deep dive. So yeah, there definitely seems to be a blog to pod pipeline, but not so much the other way. So I guess I'm kind of unique, right? I started as a podcast and I've decided to make a blog. Maybe I can make some kind of new horrible chimera like a blogcast. And in terms of popularity, just to talk about kind of the cultural impact of both, I think it really depends on who you're talking about. In general, obviously podcasters, I think, have many, many, many more listeners. But you could look at, the impact of like Cartilage Free Captain on American Spurs culture. Some of the, the way that Prof Spurs ideas have been shared across the Spurs internet is another good example. Windy has been hugely influential in driving attention in Spurs youth teams historically. So, there are some standout blogs, definitely. But podcasts in general, just, their numbers eclipse anything that I think you might get on a blog, clearly. I don't think anybody's getting tens of thousands of readers per article like Last Word on Spurs or The Fighting Cock or whoever would get on a show, on a particular episode of their podcast. So maybe I'm wrong, but I suspect I'm pretty confident that's the way around. So just a few personal thoughts on all this. I am curious about whether the use of ChatGPT is going to, lead to an increase in written content on Spurs, because a bit like you see with recipes online, where it's kind of content churning, and maybe it's already happening. Perhaps it would just be easier to produce, especially if you can lump in some adverts, stuff like that, onto the website. I always find, composing a piece of writing to be pretty impressive, and more so than kind of what I'm doing now, which is that stream of consciousness approach, which I always feel like is more character and, more character driven versus, sitting down and really contemplating and crafting a really long, nice piece of text. I don't know, maybe I'm just a hipster. But they both have a core driver, right? It's just the need to have to express and share what you want to say, and also to get validation from people. To react to what you're putting out there, to what you're saying. It's that need for human connection. It's that need to be told maybe you're good, or what you're doing is spot on, or maybe in some cases maybe there are people rage baiting, but I'm not so sure about that. So this is just a bit of a quick one today. I think I'm in about 30 minutes. I'll take that list of blogs that I've got and drop it on Bloggenham Blogspur as soon as possible. At some point I'll also do the same for the Spurs podcast and YouTube list that I've talked about before, and I've had questions about that. It is available as a Sporkle test, Sporkle quiz, if you want to go take that and see if you can guess as many of them as possible. But yeah, I'll try to update that later this year. It's kind of a pre-season state of the podcast union kind of thing. And I'll share that on Bloggenham because it will be a long list of probably about 100 or so shows. Thanks for sticking with me. What do you think? Do you have a favorite Spurs blog? Do you think there's even a point of having Spurs blogs or starting them anymore? Do you like them more than podcasts? Should they make a comeback? Should they go the way of vinyl records and LPs? Should they come back? Should we start printing them out and distributing them as fanzines? Just to stand outside the doors of New White Hart Lane, handing out your 3,000 word think piece on why Vinay Venkatesham sucks or something. Thanks for sticking with me, and I hope you subscribe to Bloggenham. There'll be a link to it in the chat. I think it's something like blogspur.substack.com. Probably should have said that sooner. Sorry. So go over there, subscribe, sign up to get it as a newsletter, or just, read it when you want to. Maybe you'll find something cool in it. Maybe you'll enjoy it. Maybe I'll make you laugh. I don't know. Try my best. But yeah, look after yourselves. Enjoy the World Cup, and I need to update my outro. Keep listening to and making Spurs podcasts, and keep reading and writing Spurs blogs. Okay. COYS.
Why are there so many podcasts about Tottenham? Do I want to know why? They might contain insight, but mostly delusions. If I hear one more, I might die. They don't like Levy, and they don't like Enoch. They pine for Moo and Conte. Someday we'll like 'em. Old Tottenham Hotspur, the podcast clout chasers, and me.